A 15-year-old girl kissed her boyfriend goodnight, walked toward a bus stop on a quiet California street, and was never seen alive again. No screams were reported. No witnesses came forward. And the man who took her life simply walked away and kept living for 43 years. He drifted from city to city, state to state, and eventually settled on a tropical island in the Pacific where he lived quietly in the sun, while Karen Stitt's family lived in the dark. They waited for answers that seemed like they would never come. They grew older. They grieved. And every single year, on the anniversary of that September night, they remembered the girl who boarded a bus and never came home. This is the story of Karen Stitt. This is Cold Case Chronicle. If this case already has your attention, hit that like button right now, subscribe to Cold Case Chronicle, and drop a comment below. Let the world know Karen's name. She deserved so much more than what happened to her on that sidewalk. And the least we can do today, right now, is make sure the world remembers her. To understand what happened to Karen Stitt, you have to understand the world she lived in. The year was 1982, and Silicon Valley was in the middle of a transformation unlike anything the world had ever seen. Palo Alto and Sunnyvale, California sat at the heart of it. These were not just tech corridors, they were communities. They were neighborhoods full of families, teenagers, schools, and local hangout spots. Kids rode buses. Parents worked long hours. Neighbors knew each other. There was a sense in that particular corner of California in that particular era that the future was not just bright, it was inevitable. Progress was in the air. Everyone felt it. And for the young people growing up there, the world felt wide open and full of possibility. Karen and Stitt had only recently arrived in that world. She was born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and her early years were spent on the East Coast. Life took turns, as it always does, and by her teenage years Karen had made the move west to California to live with her father in Palo Alto. It was a big change for a young girl. A new city, a new school, a new life to build from scratch. But Karen was the kind of person who could walk into a new situation and find her footing quickly. She enrolled at Palo Alto High School and almost immediately began leaving an impression on everyone around her. She was not hard to notice. Karen was bright-eyed, warm, and outgoing in a way that drew people to her naturally. She wore rock t-shirts and had a big, genuine smile that her friends remembered for decades. She was described by those who loved her as spunky and full of life. She laughed easily. She cared deeply about the people she let into her world. She had figured out the Bay Area's bus routes with the confidence of someone who had been navigating them her whole life, hopping on and off El Camino Real like she owned the peninsula. For a girl who had only just arrived from the East Coast, she had settled into California with a grace and ease that impressed everyone who watched her do it. By the summer of 1982, Karen had found her rhythm. She had friends at school and she had something else, a boyfriend. His name was Michael Calhoun, and he lived in nearby Sunnyvale, just a short bus ride up El Camino Real from Palo Alto. Their relationship was sweet and uncomplicated in the way that teenage relationships can be. They would meet up, spend time at Golfland, a popular miniature golf course in Sunnyvale, hang around the local 7-Eleven near Wolf Road, play video games, and just be together. There was nothing dramatic about it, nothing complicated. It was the kind of relationship that fills a teenager's world with warmth and brightness and ordinary happiness. And for Karen, after the upheaval of moving across the country and starting over in a new place, that kind of ordinary happiness meant everything. As the summer gave way to September, Karen was settling deeper into her new life. School had returned to session. The fall air was beginning to replace the warmth of the California summer. On the evening of Thursday, September the 2nd, 1982, Karen made the familiar bus ride from Palo Alto to Sunnyvale to see Michael. The two of them spent the evening together the way they always did, walking, talking, playing games, and just enjoying each other's company. It was an ordinary night. There was nothing remarkable about it, nothing to suggest that anything was wrong or that danger was anywhere near. It was just two teenagers spending time together on a warm California evening. As the hours passed and midnight approached, Michael walked Karen to the bus stop. They made their way to the corner of El Camino Real and South Wolf Road, where Karen would catch the bus back to Palo Alto. Michael had a curfew of his own to worry about, and as the night had grown late, He was already cutting it close. He watched Karen walk toward the bus stop and then, worried about getting home in time, turned and ran. He had no reason in the world to think anything was wrong. The street was familiar. The bus route was familiar. Karen had done this exact journey countless times. He ran home, slipped in before his parents noticed the hour, and went to bed. He had no idea that in those moments after he turned away, something unspeakable was happening just yards behind him on that quiet Sunnyvale street. That moment on that sidewalk was the last time anyone who loved Karen Stitt would ever see her alive. The following morning, September the 3rd, a delivery driver was making his early rounds along El Camino Real. He pulled up near a business along that stretch of road and something caught his eye. Behind a low cinder block wall, partially concealed from the street, was the body of a young girl. She was naked. Her clothes had been used to fashion ligatures around her. Her belongings were scattered and disturbed in the area surrounding her body. A boyfriend's hat that had been with her that night was found nearby. There were traces of blood on the cinder block wall itself. She was found roughly 100 yards from the bus stop where Michael had last seen her walk away. The delivery driver called authorities immediately. The Sunnyvale Department of Public Safety responded quickly and secured the scene. Investigators established a perimeter and began the painstaking work of documenting every detail of what they had found. What the medical examiner would determine was devastating in its brutality. Karen Stitt had been sexually assaulted. She had been stabbed 59 times. 59 times. The wounds were concentrated on her torso and neck. The disturbed leaves and kicked-up dirt at the scene suggested she had still been alive, fighting for her life, when the attack was carried out. She was 15 years old. She weighed next to nothing, and someone had done this to her in the dark, less than 100 yards from a public road, and then simply walked away. The evidence collected that morning would prove to be extraordinary in ways that no one in 1982 could yet fully appreciate. The killer had not only left Karen's body behind, he had left himself behind. His blood and his bodily fluid were found on Karen's body and on the blood-stained cinder block wall. In 1982, DNA technology as we know it today simply did not exist. Forensic scientists could work with blood typing and other biological indicators, but the ability to extract a unique genetic profile from biological material and match it to a specific individual was still years away from widespread use in criminal investigations. The detectives who responded that September morning could not have fully understood what those biological samples would one day become. But they were professionals, they were thorough, and they saved everything. That decision, to preserve that evidence with care, would matter more than anyone in that parking lot could possibly have known. Karen's family received the news that morning in the way that no family should ever have to receive any news. Her father, who had brought her to California, who had been her anchor in her new life, was shattered. Her sister Suzanne was devastated. Her Aunt Robin Morris, who would spend the next 43 years fighting for answers from her home in Florida, felt her world collapse. Close friends like Tracy Lancaster, who had known Karen at Palo Alto High School, could not comprehend that the girl they had laughed with and confided in was gone. Michael Calhoun, the boyfriend who had walked her to that bus stop and then run home to beat his curfew, was consumed by a grief and a guilt and a confusion that would stay with him for the rest of his life. He had watched her walk toward that stop. He had turned away, and she had never come home. The news spread through Palo Alto High School like a wave of cold water. Students and teachers who had known Karen, or who had simply passed her in the hallways, struggled to understand what had happened. She had only just arrived. She had barely had time to leave her mark, and already she was gone. The communities of Palo Alto and Sunnyvale, that part of the Bay Area Peninsula that was supposed to be the future, where everything was going right and progress was the order of every day, were left reeling. Parents held their children tighter. Students looked at the familiar bus stops along El Camino Real differently. A 15-year-old girl had been murdered in the open, just feet from a public road, in a neighborhood where people thought they were safe. Detectives worked the case with everything they had. They canvassed the area around the bus stop, knocking on every door within range of the scene. They interviewed passengers who had been on late-night buses along that stretch of El Camino Real. They spoke to residents, business owners, and anyone who might have been in the area near midnight on September the 2nd. Fingerprints were taken where possible. Timelines were carefully constructed. Every lead, however small, was followed. Michael Calhoun, as the last person known to have seen Karen alive, came under scrutiny early. That was standard investigative procedure. He cooperated fully and completely. He sat with detectives and walked them through every moment of that evening, where they had gone, what they had done, the route to the bus stop, the moment he turned and ran home. His account never changed. His manner was consistent and open. He was clearly devastated. But in 1982, without the forensic tools to confirm what detectives suspected about his innocence, his name remained attached to the case in a painful and deeply unfair way. Despite the thoroughness of the early investigation, the weeks following Karen's murder produced no clear suspect. The case generated significant attention across the Bay Area. Newspapers ran the story. Local television stations pressed for answers. Community members held on to hope that someone would come forward, that a witness would emerge, that some piece of evidence would crack the case open. But as weeks became months and months stretched toward the end of the year, the leads dried up one by one.
No witness materialized.
No suspect was identified. The biological evidence sat in storage, waiting for a science that had not yet arrived. By the mid-1980s, with no new developments and investigative resources shifting to more active cases, Karen Stitt's case had crossed the threshold into what law enforcement refers to as a cold case. Her file was carefully preserved in the records of the Sunnyvale Department of Public Safety. Open, unsolved, and heartbreakingly silent. For Karen's loved ones, the years that followed were lived in a particular kind of grief. It was not just the grief of loss, though that was bottomless. It was the grief of not knowing, of having no answer to the question that sat at the center of every single day. Who did this and why? Karen's ashes were eventually spread by her sister Suzanne over Mount Tamalpais in Mill Valley, a beautiful place of wide sky and quiet hills that offered some small measure of peace in the absence of everything else. Family members held onto their memories of Karen as tightly as they could. Her rock t-shirts, her smile, her independence, her humor, her warmth, the future she was supposed to have. And year after year, as the world changed around them and Silicon Valley transformed itself into the most powerful technology corridor on Earth, Karen's family and friends carried their unanswered question forward with them. They wondered. They waited. They never forgot. If you are still watching at this point, drop a comment right now that says I am still here. Let's see who is truly following Karen's story all the way through. Because what comes next is where everything changes. Years turned into decades, and technology advanced in ways that the investigators of 1982 could never have predicted. In the late 1990s and into the early 2000s, DNA testing became a powerful and increasingly precise tool in criminal investigations. Law enforcement agencies across the country began revisiting old evidence from cold cases, running biological samples through newly built national databases in the hope of finding matches. In the year 2000, investigators returned to Karen's case with these updated methods. The biological material collected from that September morning in 1982 was re-examined. The results confirmed that a clear DNA profile of the killer existed within that evidence. It was a significant and meaningful development, but there was still no name to attach to it. The profile sat in the National Codes database, a genetic ghost, present, real, and identifiable but anonymous. No match came back. The killer was still out there, still unidentified, still free. And Karen's boyfriend Michael Calhoun was formally and definitively cleared. The DNA evidence excluded him completely. He had told the truth for nearly 20 years, and now science had confirmed it. But the man who was actually responsible remained in the shadows. For nearly 2 more decades after that, the case sat still. The profile in the database waited for a name. No match came, and Gary Ramirez went on living his quiet life far from California, far from El Camino Real, far from the cinder block wall where he had left a 15-year-old girl in the dark. Then, in 2018, the landscape of cold case investigation changed dramatically. A team of investigators, genealogists, and forensic scientists in California cracked the case of the Golden State Killer, one of the most notorious unidentified serial criminals in American history. using a then-revolutionary technique called investigative genetic genealogy. Rather than simply searching a database of convicted criminals for a DNA match, investigators had built out family trees using public genealogy databases to identify relatives of the unknown suspect, and then worked methodically through those family trees to narrow down the possible candidates until they arrived at a name. The technique was powerful, precise, and it opened a new door for every cold case in the country that had biological evidence and no matching profile in the existing criminal databases. One of those cases was Karen Stitt's. Sunnyvale Department of Public Safety Detective Matt Hutchison had grown up in Sunnyvale. He knew the streets Karen had walked. He understood in a visceral, personal way what it meant that this case had never been solved. When he took over Karen's cold case file in 2018, he approached it with the focus and tenacity of someone who had made a decision that this case was going to end differently. He studied every page of the file. He absorbed every lead, every dead end, every piece of evidence that had been preserved over nearly 4 decades. He believed, with the new tools available to him, that an answer was within reach. In early 2019, a tip came in. The tip pointed investigators toward a family from Fresno, California. Specifically, it suggested that Karen Stitt's killer was likely one of 4 brothers. Hutchison partnered with an expert forensic genealogist, and the two of them began the painstaking process that this kind of investigation requires. They constructed family trees. They cross-referenced DNA profiles from public genealogy databases against the biological evidence preserved from the crime scene. They followed every branch of every relevant family line, and they systematically eliminated candidates one by one. It was meticulous, slow, and demanding work. The kind of work that requires patience and precision in equal measure. But Hutchison was not in a hurry. He was in pursuit. 3 of the 4 brothers were ruled out. That left one name: Gary Ramirez. Ramirez had been born and raised in Fresno, California. He had served in the United States Air Force in the early 1970s, and after leaving the military had drifted through several different lives in several different places. He had spent time in the Bay Area Peninsula, the same peninsula where Karen Stitt had been navigating the bus routes, eating miniature golf and arcade games with her boyfriend, and just beginning to build a life. He had also spent time in San Francisco, in San Diego, and in Colorado. Eventually, he had made his way to the Hawaiian island of Maui, where he had settled into a quiet, unremarkable existence. He worked odd jobs. He worked at various points as a pest exterminator. He had no known criminal record. To anyone who encountered him in Makawao on Maui, he was simply an older man living out his days in one of the most beautiful places on Earth. He had been doing exactly that. Living, breathing, growing old, watching sunsets over the Pacific, for decades, while Karen Stitt's family never once stopped wondering what had happened to her on that September night. Hutchison tracked down one of Gary Ramirez's children in April of 2022. Working carefully and with the cooperation of that child, investigators obtained a DNA sample. The sample was sent to the Santa Clara County District Attorney's crime lab for analysis and comparison against the biological material collected from the crime scene on September 3, 1982. The results came back with a high probability match. Gary Ramirez was identified as the likely source of the blood and bodily fluid left on Karen Stitt's body and on the cinder block wall where her killer had left her. That result was enough to obtain a search warrant to swab Ramirez directly. The warrant was served. The swab was taken. The crime lab ran the comparison. And the result came back as a confirmed match. 40 years after Karen Stitt was murdered, the genetic fingerprint of her killer had a name. What followed was months of planning. The operation to arrest Gary Ramirez was a coordinated effort involving Santa Clara County law enforcement, Maui law enforcement, and federal authorities. It was funded in large part by a grant awarded to the District Attorney's Office in 2021 by the United States Department of Justice specifically to investigate and prosecute cold cases. Every detail was worked through carefully. Every contingency was considered. And on August 2, 2022, officers moved on Ramirez's home in Makawao on the island of Maui. Gary Ramirez was 75 years old. He was taken into custody at his home, 40 years and 11 months after he had left a 15-year-old girl dying behind a cinder block wall in Sunnyvale, California. The news of the arrest sent shockwaves through the communities that had carried Karen's story for 40 years. Detective Hutchison was able to reach Karen's brother, her only living immediate family member at that point, with the news that an arrest had been made. Tragically, Karen's parents had not lived to see this day. They had died without ever knowing who had taken their daughter from them. But there were others who had waited, who had carried Karen's name and Karen's memory and Karen's unanswered question forward through the decades. Her Aunt Robin Morris in Florida, her best friend Tracy Lancaster, and Michael Calhoun, the boy who had walked her to that bus stop and spent the next 40 years working in law enforcement, in part because of what happened to Karen, trying to give other victims what Karen's family had been denied for so long. Karen's Aunt Robin said that when she heard the news, it was as though a wound had been reopened, but that for the first time in 40 years, she also felt something that resembled relief. Something that felt, if not like peace, then like the beginning of it. Detective Hutchison told reporters plainly that the technology that had finally cracked the case had not been available to the detectives who had worked it for the previous 40 years. But it was available to him. And he said, with the quiet certainty of someone who had never stopped believing the case could be solved, that he felt a responsibility to these victims no matter how old the case was. On August 10, 2022, Gary Ramirez appeared in a Hawaii courtroom and agreed to extradition. He was brought back to California and housed in the Santa Clara County Jail, where he awaited arraignment on charges of murder, kidnapping, and rape. The legal process moved forward through the following years, slowly and carefully, as serious cases of this nature require. And then, on February 24, 2025, Gary Ramirez appeared in a San Jose courtroom to enter his plea. He was 77 years old. He walked into court with a cane. His long gray hair was pulled back in a ponytail. He wore glasses. His attorney had requested that he not appear on camera. He took his seat and sat silently, looking forward or down, as the people who had loved Karen Stitt for 43 years stood up one by one and looked directly at the man who had taken her from them. In a barely audible voice, Gary Gene Ramirez pleaded no contest to first-degree murder. Under California law, that plea is treated the same as a guilty plea for purposes of sentencing. But it was not a confession. It was not an admission in the full and human sense of the word. He did not stand up and say what he had done. He did not speak to Karen's family. He did not offer a single word of explanation or acknowledgement to the people who had waited 43 years for him to be in that room. His Aunt Robin Morris, calling in from Florida because she could not be there in person, was not satisfied. She said that she wanted him to admit the truth. She said that she wished he would speak to her personally and tell her why. He never did. He sat silently as the room around him bore the full weight of everything he had chosen not to say. On May 12, 2025, Gary Ramirez was sentenced by Judge Hanley Chu in Santa Clara County. The courtroom was full. Many of Karen's family members and friends had made the journey to be there, to sit in those seats, to see the ending of a story that had consumed a piece of every year of their lives for more than 4 decades. Judge Chu sentenced Ramirez to 25 years to life in state prison. It was the maximum sentence available under the circumstances. Given Ramirez's age of 78 and the credit applied for time already served, parole eligibility would arrive only when he was well into his 90s. For every meaningful purpose, Gary Gene Ramirez will die in prison. Michael Calhoun stood before the court and spoke. He said that the heinous crimes that ended Karen's life in such a horrific way had caused deep heartache and continued suffering for the many people who loved her. He said that even now, with Ramirez sentenced and behind bars, there would still never be true closure. Karen was gone. They would never get her back. Nothing about a courtroom sentence could undo what had happened on that sidewalk on the night of September 2, 1982. And yet Michael Calhoun had spent his entire adult life in law enforcement, serving others, trying to give to other victims what Karen's family had been denied. He said he would carry Karen in his heart and in his soul until his last breath on this earth, and that he hoped she was resting in peace. Tracy Lancaster, Karen's best friend, stood and spoke from the same place of grief and hard-won peace. She said that since Karen had been brutally taken from them, the biggest question had always been why. It was the question that had no answer even now. She said there would never be true justice because Karen could not come back. But knowing that the man who had done this would never be able to hurt another person brought her a measure of peace she had not felt in 43 years. It was not everything. It was not justice in the full and complete sense of the word. But it was something. And after 43 years of nothing, something mattered. District Attorney Jeff Rosen addressed the court and the public with words that had been 43 years in the making. He said that over 40 years ago, Karen Stitt had lost her life, but she had not been forgotten. He said that thanks to a dedicated detective, a persistent prosecutor, and a crime lab that never gave up, the person responsible was behind bars. He noted that Karen Stitt, had she lived, would have been 57 years old at the time of the conviction. 57 years old. She would have lived a whole life. She would have had decades of ordinary days and extraordinary moments, of friendships and perhaps love and perhaps a family of her own. She would have had all of it. Instead she had September 2nd, 1982, and a bus stop on El Camino Real, and a man she had never met who decided in the dark that her life did not matter. Gary Ramirez has been committed to the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation. He is imprisoned in a California state prison. He will grow older there and he will, in all probability, die there. The man who lived freely for 40 years, who drifted from city to city and eventually found himself a quiet life in the Hawaiian sun, will end his days behind walls and under guard. And Karen Stitt, the girl who wore rock t-shirts and navigated the Bay Area's bus routes and made friends easily and laughed well and loved the people in her life, will be remembered. She will be remembered in a courtroom in San Jose where the people who loved her stood up and said her name. She will be remembered by Michael Calhoun, who joined law enforcement because of her and who carried her with him through every year of his career. She will be remembered by Tracy Lancaster, who asked the question that has no answer and found peace in the only answer that was ever available. She will be remembered by her sister Suzanne, who spread her ashes over the hills of Mount Tamalpais and gave her a resting place as beautiful as she deserved. She will be remembered by her Aunt Robin Morris, who called in from Florida and refused to let Gary Ramirez sit in that courtroom without feeling the full weight of what he had done. And she will be remembered here on Cold Case Chronicle, where we do not let these cases go and we do not let these names fade. Karen Stitt was 15 years old. She was spunky and bright and warm and full of life. She figured out the bus routes. She settled into a new city with grace. She made people feel at ease just by being in the room. She boarded a bus to visit someone she cared about on an ordinary Thursday night in September. And she deserved to make it home. She deserved every single thing that was supposed to come next. She did not get any of it. But she was not forgotten. She was never forgotten. And now, at last, her story has an ending. If Karen's story moved you today, share this video right now and use the hashtag #JusticeForKaren on every platform you are on. It took 43 years to put her killer behind bars. The least we can do is make sure the entire world knows who Karen Stitt was and what was taken from her on that September night in 1982. Subscribe to Cold Case Chronicle right now if you have not already, because we are not done. There are more names. There are more stories. There are more families waiting for the day that someone finally comes forward with an answer. We will be here for every single one of them, and we will not stop until every story gets told.